In this video, we'll continue reviewing Chapter 28, Teddy Roosevelt, and then William Taft. The Roosevelt Panic of 1907 was part of Roosevelt's second term, 1905 to 1909. During this time, he called for regulating corporations, taxing incomes, and protecting workers. He declared in 1904 under no circumstances would he be a candidate for a third term. He suffered a sharp setback in 1907 when a short panic descended on Wall Street. There were frightened runs on the banks. The financial world blamed Roosevelt for this, and the conservatives called him Theodore the Meddler. The results of the 1907 panic paved the way for long overdue monetary reforms. Currency shortages showed the need for a more elastic medium of exchange, so Congress in 1908 responded with the Aldrich Violent Act, which authorized national banks to issue emergency currency backed by various kinds of collateral. This pathway was smooth for the momentous Federal Reserve Act of 1913 as a result. Roosevelt in 1908 could have won a second presidential nomination and won the election. However, he felt bound by the promise of 1904. He sought a successor who would carry out my policies. He selected William Henry Taft, the Secretary of War, and a mild progressive. He often served when Roosevelt was away. This is a political cartoon called Baby Kiss Papa Goodbye, showing Theodore Roosevelt leaving his baby, which is his policies, in the hands of his chosen successor, William Howard Taft. Eventually, though, there will be friction between the two men, prompting Roosevelt to return to politics and challenge Taft for the presidency. In 1908, TR steamrolled the convention to get Taft's nomination on the first ballot, and the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan again. In the campaign of 1908, Taft and Bryan both tried to claim progressive Teddy Roosevelt's mantle. The majority still chose the stability, with Roosevelt endorsed Taft, who polled 321 electoral votes to 162 for Bryan. The Socialists had amassed 420,000 votes for Eugene V. Debs. Roosevelt was branded by adversaries as a wild-eyed radical. There were a number of laws he inspired that were not in proportion to the amount of noise that he made. He was also attacked by reigning business lords, but they knew they had a friend in the White House. Roosevelt should first and foremost be remembered as a cowboy who tamed the bronco of adolescent capitalism, thus ensuring it a long adult life. Roosevelt's achievements and popularity were stemming from his youthfulness, which appealed to young of all ages. He served as a political lightning rod to protect capitalists against popular indignation and against socialism, and he sought the middle road between unbridled individualism and paternalistic collectivism. In the conservation crusade, he tried to mediate between the romantic preservationists and rapacious resource predators. This was probably his most typical and his most lasting achievement, was conservation. Other contributions of Roosevelt was a greatly enlarged power and prestige of the presidency, which helped shape progressive movements and later liberal reform, and it opened the eyes of Americans to the fact that they shared the world with other nations and needed to accept responsibilities of a great power. William Howard Taft had an enviable reputation as a lawyer and a judge. He was a trusted administrator under Roosevelt. He suffered from lethal political handicaps, though. He was not a dashing political leader like Teddy Roosevelt, and he was recoiling from controversy. When he faced controversy, Taft generally adopted the attitude of passivity against Congress, or towards Congress. Taft was actually a poor judge of public opinion. His candor made him a chronic victim of foot-in-the-mouth disease. He was also a mild progressive, but at heart was wedded to the status quo rather than to change. His cabinet did not contain a single representative of the party's insurgent wing. This is a political cartoon showing ex-President Theodore Roosevelt watching President Taft struggle with the demands of government. Taft's foreign policy was to use investments to boost American political interests abroad, which was called dollar diplomacy. This encouraged Wall Street to invest in foreign areas of strategic concern to the United States, especially the Far East and the Panama Canal. Thus, bankers would strengthen American defenses and foreign policies and bring prosperity back to the homeland. The almighty dollar supplanted Teddy Roosevelt's big stick, and the railroad investments in Manchuria were Taft's most spectacular effort, but Russia and Japan both blocked the effort. There was a new trouble spot in the revolution-riddled Caribbean. Also, Wall Street was encouraged to pump dollars into the financial vacuums in Honduras and Haiti to keep foreign funds out. After sporadic disorders in Cuba, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic, American forces were brought in to restore order and protect American investments. 2,500 Marines were brought in 1912 to Nicaragua, and they remained there for 13 years. Taft gained some fame as a smasher of monopolies as well. He brought a total of 90 suits against trusts during his 4 years compared to only 44 for Roosevelt in 7.5 years. The biggest action came in 1911 when the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company. Judged to be a combination in restraint of trade and in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, Rockefeller's company was forced to separate. The Supreme Court also handed down its famous rule of reason, which meant this doctrine said that only those combinations that unreasonably restrained trade were illegal, and this doctrine tore a big hole in government's antitrust net. So in 1911, the antitrust suit against U.S. Steel Corporation was brought. This infuriated Roosevelt, who had encouraged the merger, and once Roosevelt's protege, President Taft, increasingly takes on the role of his antagonist. The progressives in the Republican Party wanted lower tariffs, and they really initially thought they had a friend in Taft, but the House passed a moderately reductive bill, and the Senate then added numerous upward tariff revisions, and much to the dismay of supporters, Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich bill and called it the best bill that the Republican Party had ever passed. Taft proved to be dedicated to conservation. He established the Bureau of Mines to control mineral resources. His accomplishments were overshadowed by the Ballinger-Pinchot quarrel in 1910, in which the Secretary of Interior, Richard Ballinger, opened public lands in Wyoming, Montana, and Alaska to corporate use. And Ballinger was sharply criticized by Gifford Pinchot, who was chief of the Agricultural Department's Division of Forestry, and who was a stalwart Rooseveltian. Taft dismissed Pinchot on charges of insubordination, which widened the rift between Roosevelt and Taft. The reformist wing of the Republican Party was also up in arms. Taft was being pushed into the arms of the old guard, and by 1910 the grand old party was split wide open, largely due to the decisions and clumsiness of Taft. Roosevelt returned in 1910 and stirred up the tempest by giving a flaming speech at Ottawasamie, Kansas. He announced the doctrine of the New Nationalism, which urged the national government to increase its power to remedy economic and social abuses. The results of the divisions within the Republican Party were that they lost badly in the congressional elections of 1910. The Democrats emerged with a total of 228 seats, leaving the once dominant Republicans with only 161. A socialist representative, Victor Berger, was elected from Milwaukee as well, and the Republicans, by virtue of the holdovers, retained the Senate from 51 to 41, but even there, reformers challenged the old guard. This was now a full-fledged revolt. In 1911, the National Progressive Republican League formed, and fiery Senator La Follette of Wisconsin became the leading presidential candidate for the group. In February 1912, Roosevelt wrote to 7 governors that he was willing to accept the Republican nomination. His reasoning was that a third-term tradition applied to 3 consecutive elective terms, and Roosevelt entered the primaries, pushing La Follette aside. The Taft-Roosevelt explosion happened in June of 1912 at the Republican Convention in Chicago. Rooseveltites were about 100 delegates short of winning the nomination, and they challenged the right of some 250 Taft delegates to be seated at the convention. Most of the contests were settled for Taft, and Roosevelt refused to quit the game. Having tasted for the first time the bitter cup of defeat, Teddy Roosevelt led a third-party crusade. The Democrats were jubilant over the Republican divisions and with the beginning of the Bull Moose campaign of 1912. They assumed that they could win in 1912 with a strong reformer, so they chose Governor Woodrow Wilson, who seemed like a good fit. He was a scholar of government who became a reformist and was president of Princeton University in 1902. He was elected the governor of New Jersey in 1910, and Wilson had campaigned against predatory trusts. Once elected, Wilson would drive through the legislature a number of progressive reforms. The Democrats met at Baltimore in 1912 and nominated Wilson, aided by William Jennings Bryan's switch to his side, and his progressive reform platform was dubbed the New Freedom. The progressive Republican ticket had a third party with Roosevelt as its candidate for president, and the pro-Roosevelt supporters held the convention in Chicago in August of 1912. The Settlement House pioneer Jane Addams placed Roosevelt's name in nomination for the presidency. This symbolized the rising political status of women as well as progressive support for social justice. Roosevelt received thunderous applause when he declared, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose. Thus, this is why this is called the Bull Moose Campaign of 1912. This is a picture, a political cartoon called The Finishing Touch, which shows that despite the excitement generated by Roosevelt's Progressive Party challenge, the GOP split helped hand the victory to the Democrats. And this cartoon shows Woodrow Wilson attired in academic garb, preparing to slay Roosevelt, the charging bull moose. The big issue of the campaign of 1912 was the two versions of reform. Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson agreed on more active government but disagreed on specific strategies. Roosevelt's platform was the New Nationalism, which was based on the ideas of progressive thinker Herbert Cody in his book The Promise of American Life. It favored continued consolidation of trusts and labor unions, and this was to be paralleled by growth of powerful regulatory agencies. He also campaigned for women's suffrage. The broad program also included social welfare, including minimum wage laws and publicly supported health care. Roosevelt's progressives looked forward to a comprehensive welfare state of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Wilson's New Freedom favored small enterprise and entrepreneurship. It also favored free functioning of unregulated, unmonopolized markets. It shunned social welfare proposals and pinned economic faith on competition, saying that the man on the make, as Wilson put it, was somebody to help the economy move forward. Banking reform and tariff reduction were also part of the platform, and the keynote of Wilson's campaign was not regulation, but fragmentation of big industrial combines, chiefly by vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws. The election of 1912 offered voters a choice not merely of policies, but of political and economic philosophies as well, which was a rarity in U.S. history. The election returns came in. Wilson won 435 electoral votes and a majority of popular votes as well, 41%. Roosevelt finished second with 88 electoral votes, and Taft only won 8 electoral votes. The socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs rolled up 900,000 popular votes, 6% of the total cast. This is a map showing the presidential election of 1912, showing votes by county and electoral votes by state. Taft himself had a fruitful old age. He taught law for 8 years at Yale University, and in 1921 he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a job for which he was far better suited than the presidency. And this is the chronology from the chapter.